what he's getting at is the central question is whether or not it's a good thing to have scientific research be funded in large part by the federal government. So there's been a lot of discussion about the grant funding that's been going on alongside of funding of science in general. And I thought it would be worthwhile to walk through a little bit of history here. Where does the funding for science come from? Where has it come from previously? Where does it come from predominantly now? And some of the interesting things in history that have come up before getting into anything else about the problems associated with the current model of funding scientific research in the United States, and this will be United States specific more so than it will be for any other country or international grants or anything like that. So, just as a fair point, I think it's a worthwhile bit of history. And to start, where I want to start is this article from Boston University, actually, because it's quite thorough. And it gets to the point very quickly that I want to get to. I'm not going to read the whole thing, but I'm going to go to the relevant sections to make the point here, because one of the reasons this has come up, of course, is with things going on in the news related to the funding of science, to higher education, to the like. And so that's why I want to get into this, to just talk about what the history has been, where we are kind of nowadays, and thinking ahead a bit for the future. Who picks up the tab for science? And as always, this will all be linked in the description, so please feel free to go read. Part one of a 4-part series. For half a century, the government funded research. Times are changing. This is actually from April of 2015, so it's a little old, but content-wise, it is still very, very relevant. Finding money for scientific research used to be a lot more straightforward. People got it from people they knew. In the 1870s, when Alexander Graham Bell needed money to develop his harmonic telegraph, which, if you don't know, is what we call the phone today, the precursor to the smartphone, he got much of it from the wealthy father of one of his students, 16-year-old Mabel Hubbard. Bell and Hubbard would eventually marry. Bell, who was at the time professor of vocal physiology and elocution at Boston University School of Oratory, even borrowed money from his famous assistant, Thomas Watson. Throughout the ages, science has moved forward with boosts from many well-heeled patrons, from monarchs to millionaires. Galileo's heretical revelation that the Earth revolved around the sun would have been unlikely if not for his education at the University of Pisa, which was founded by Pope Clement VI, remembered even today as a devoted patron of the arts and learning. 4 centuries after Clement, German universities adopted the notion that it was the Academy's responsibility to advance the understanding of science, a conviction that we take for granted today. We also think the government should pay for research, and it does for the vast majority of it. But since government funding flatlined several years ago, scientists at Boston University and universities around the country are very worried, not just about their research, but about the future of science in America. Now, this is, of course, 2015, so we'll take that for what it's worth. But I want to go down here because here we go. This is actually the relevant section in terms of the history. I do want to get into the funding numbers, but I have a different tab that I think does that better than this article does. The government steps up. Before World War II, government money for research was rare and was mostly aimed at aeronautics and agriculture studies. So where did the money for basic science come from back then? Basic science, just as a point, is about fundamental research, answering some very deep fundamental questions about how things work. This is different from applied research. You're talking about different applications like societal needs, or say like best places to put a dam or a levee, or interests in ecology and what have you, that go past the fundamental questions and talk about their applications to different things. There's a cat behind me. Okay. Let's see. As an MIT historian, actually, there's a whole video I did on the difference between basic and applied research, so you can go back and look in the archive for that too. As MIT historian and physicist David Kaiser wrote in Nature, science and technology research at American universities was historically funded by local industry, philanthropy, and universities themselves. That model leaped toward industry in 1919 when MIT created a division of industrial cooperation and research, and essentially inviting corporations to pay for academic research. A decade later, according to Kaiser, more than a third of MIT faculty were working for corporate sponsors. All was good until the stock market crashed, taking with it 60% of the budgets for some departments. The crash also staunched the flow of funding from foundations. Homer Alfred Thiel, Tobin Smith, and Jennifer McCormick, authors of Beyond Sputnik, U.S. Science Policy in the 21st Century, wrote that in 1931, total grants from American foundations amounted to $52.5 million. 3 years later, it was $34 million, and the devastation was lasting. As late as 1940, it was $10 million less than it had been in 1931. In 1940, pre-war concerns spurred President Franklin Delano Roosevelt to invent a new model of federal funding for science research and development quickly. He created the National Defense Research Committee, which evolved into the Office of Scientific Research and Development, a well-funded octopus whose projects would soon include wartime research on a variety of topics, from radar to malaria, as well as the Manhattan Project, code name for the World War II research and development project that produced the atomic bomb. Okay, that's Boston University. But all of this is to say, where the government funding of scientific research started in serious earnestness was World War II in the United States, because needed to spur up technologies quickly, and there was a need and a rush to get ahead of the Germans, and later, as it would continue during the Cold War, the Soviets, and the like. So there are those kinds of things here in which resulted in the development of science, and that's going to be critical for a little later in one of the things I want to close with. In Washington, the wartime scramble to meet military needs was carved into policy when Roosevelt placed OSRD under the chairmanship of Vannevar Bush, a former MIT president and vice president, and dean and president of the Carnegie Institute. Asked to design an apparatus that could fund science in the post-war years, Bush penned the historic report Science, the Endless Frontier. He is now regarded as the architect of all government funding for university research. In 1950, President Harry Truman created the National Science Foundation, charging it with developing a national policy for the promotion of basic research. For the next 5.5 decades, the federal funding tap flowed with gradually increasing velocity, with marked leaps that coincided with perceived threats to national security or economic angst. In 1957, for example, the year before the USSR launched Sputnik, the NSF budget was $40 million. In 1959, it was $134 million, and by 1968, Cold War concerns had shot it up nearly $500 million. Other bursts attended the gas crisis of the 1970s, President Ronald Reagan's Star Wars Strategic Defense Initiative in 1983, and continuing concern about the health of baby boomers in the 1990s, and the 9/11 terrorist attack on the World Trade Center in 2001. Money from that expansion helped pay for the National Emerging Infectious Disease Laboratory on the medical campus. So all of this is to say that over time, funding from the federal government for scientific research going to universities has changed and grown over time. That's not to say that it is steadily increasing over time, and here's the point I want to make on that. This comes from the National Science Foundation, the National Center for Science and Engineering Statistics, and I found it was the reason I like this page is because you can interact with a lot of the graphics, so it does make it easy to see, going back and forth over time, what's happened with scientific research in the United States, and particularly the funding for it. And this is actually what I want to show right here to make the point, because over time, this dark blue line right here is the percentage of basic research that was funded by the federal government, one agency or another. Doesn't matter which one, but funded by them. And what you can actually see in this, going all the way out to 2022, which is the most recent thing that they have data here for, is that 40% in 2022 of all basic research was funded by the government, by the federal government. Contrast that, the increase here that is actually quite fascinating is the basic research. Again, this is fundamental foundational things funded by businesses has actually increased pretty dramatically over time, and following along a corresponding decrease that you get from funding from the government in terms of percentage of the total. The actual total amount of dollars has also itself changed over time, but that's not the key thing here. And these other lines down here are actually non-federal government. So this could be state governments. This could be local governments in here. You have nonprofits organizations in here, as well as universities, because some universities do have their own funds for these different kinds of activities. So this is the point to make of this is actually since the 70s or so, this is percentage wise has been actually on quite a decline from the federal government. Though it's still, plural, not the outright majority. If you take businesses and the federal government together, that is, well, truly a supermajority at nearly 80%. But it is not a majority from the federal government like it was, I think the high point right here, is 1967, which is 72% of all basic research was funded by the United States federal government, if you were here in the United States anyway. You go down here into all of this. So federal budget authority for basic research as percentage of total R&D budget authority. And what they mean by budget authority with this is money allocated by Congress for this. These are preliminary numbers in here for some of the other years, but you can see over time, federal budget authority for basic research as a percentage of total R&D. So the budget from Congress has steadily, percentage of the budget toward R&D. Federal budget authority for basic research as a percentage of total R&D. Okay, multiple kinds of R&D. This is the percentage that Congress has allocated of the total R&D to go toward basic research specifically. So this is where the big difference comes in with that. Remember I said at the beginning, there's also a difference between applied research and basic research. There's also experimental development of different things and technologies and what have you that are unique and different. You stack these up together, you get 100%. The big one down here, basic research is 32% as of the 2022 numbers, and experimental development is actually the biggest one at almost at 39.1% in this particular case. Applied research is the smallest, though it has actually grown a bit over time itself, as you can kind of see that because it's 25 some odd here, grown up to 28 or so. Probably the biggest high point in here was no. Actually, come to think of it, it hasn't changed all that much. The applied research side hasn't changed all that much. U.S. expenditures, R&D expenditures, this is millions of constant U.S. dollars, so this is adjusted to 2017 numbers in here, and this is the total. So total, about a bunch of that coming from the federal government in here, a bunch of that coming from businesses. Involved too, but you can actually see the number here for the federal government in terms of millions of constant US dollars, 2017. This is actually, so add a couple of zeros to that, closer to $135 billion in terms of R&D expenditures to begin with. Federal budget authority for basic research. Again, this is what Congress allocates in terms of both, dollars as you go along, but also adjusted to 2017 numbers in here, which this would be 2017 numbers in here in billions. Although that doesn't make entirely, I'm missing something here because it doesn't make entirely too much sense to me. But anyway, but my point in all of this is that the numbers have definitely changed over time. A lot of that basic research funding actually goes toward health. Health issues in particular. And I think if I go all the way down here, here it is. Federal obligations for basic research by agency 1967 to 2023. And what you're going to see in here is this big blue bar right here is the Health and Human Services. Department of Health and Human Services is easily the largest obligation of basic research dollars for any given agency in the federal government. According to the National Science Foundation itself, the National Science Foundation is an itty-bitty one, which I think is, that light purple one near the top. That's NASA, Department of Energy, Department of Defense, and U.S. Department of Agriculture, and everything else is an itty-bitty chunk. You can go along down here. I won't belabor the point here because this is a great article if you're looking for information about the change in funding dollars over time and the like. So I encourage you to go to take a look at it. It's certainly very interesting in here in terms of what what gets spent where, and getting a good sense of that. And, the nice thing about it, when you think about it, the funding model actually has been great in causing there to be production of amazing technologies and things that we rely on today, that we have built upon since and also rely on today. Such basic things as radar, for example, which we use in weather forecasting every single day. Everybody's got the bloody little radar app on the phone now, right? Well, that wouldn't have started without the funding for that kind of basic research that is so critical. Another place you can look, by the way, if you want more, I'll link this in the description too, but if you want more on historical trends, this is the American Association for the Advancement of Sciences actually has a very detailed thing here too about the budget and spending related toward research and development and scientific research and development. And you got to think about it carefully, because a lot of the funded research, one of the reasons it's continued to be the case, have had federal government funding of scientific research in the United States, is because there has been significant return on investment in a huge number of things, technology wise, innovation wise, with medicine, with engineering, with hydrology, with any of the number of the sciences. It's really, really relevant to things going on in our world today. And so that should always continue. But there's also, of course, the question of, well, what's the danger in doing that, right? Because it's one way of doing it, and we didn't before World War II. We didn't really do it that way. You had to rely on corporations. You relied on wealthy benefactors. You relied on any number of different things to actually do that scientific research. And I'm sure there's probably an analogous situation in Europe, but here in particular, thinking like Alexander Graham Bell's invention of the phone, well, that came about in part because of a wealthy benefactor, not because of any federal government funding. That was the 1800s. So what might be a cause for concern? For that, I want to go, and I'll put some context into this first before I go too much further. I want to go to the farewell address of President Dwight Eisenhower. Some folks will remember this address because it's famous in Eisenhower's warning partway through the address against the establishment of what he called the military-industrial complex. That's not what I'm going to talk about specifically, but the reason I have to bring it up is because what I'm going to talk about is related to his comments, because he mentions this particular aspect shortly after. And I think this hasn't gotten mentioned in quite a while, but I'm going to read the front part of this here for the context of when Dwight Eisenhower gave the speech and what was going on. Because this is 1961. This would have been after the founding of the National Science Foundation. This would have been after the founding of all of those things that we talked about in the historical documentation that Boston University had. But there are some interesting things that Eisenhower said that perhaps weren't thinking about them carefully. In light of how we fund scientific research, knowing that it has been a good thing, it has produced lots of good things, but there are things to always be cautious about, particularly when most of the money comes from the government to fund that research. January 17th, 1961, in his farewell address, President Dwight Eisenhower warned against the establishment of a military-industrial complex. In a speech of less than 10 minutes on January 17th, 1961, President Dwight Eisenhower delivered his political farewell to the American people on national television from the Oval Office of the White House. Those who expected the military leader and hero of World War II to depart his presidency with a nostalgic old soldier speech like General Douglas MacArthur's were surprised at his strong warnings about the dangers of the military-industrial complex. People do have to remember Eisenhower was a war hero from World War II himself, so he is very familiar with everything that was going on with World War II. As president of the United States for 2 terms, Eisenhower had slowed the push for increased defense spending despite pressure to build more military equipment during the Cold War's arms race. Nonetheless, the American military services and the defense industry had expanded a great deal in the 1950s. Eisenhower thought this growth was needed to counter the Soviet Union, but it confounded him. Though he did not say so explicitly, his standing as a military leader helped give him the credibility to stand up to the pressures of this new, powerful interest group. He eventually described it as a necessary evil. Now, I want to go on further because from here, because that's the key statement, but I want to actually go into Eisenhower's full speech and show you that whole section where he talks about that. Because he does actually mention what seems little noticed in this speech is he mentions actually something about the funding mechanism of science back at the time that he was concerned about. Here it is. It's this section right here. It's not too far into it, so it starts up here. This is actually where he's getting into the military question. A vital element in keeping, this is President Dwight Eisenhower, 1961. A vital element in keeping the peace is our military establishment. Our arms must be mighty, ready for instant action, so that no potential aggressor may be tempted to risk his own destruction. Our military organization today bears little relation to that known by any of my predecessors in peacetime, or indeed by the fighting men of World War II or Korea. In councils of government, I'm going to skip down here because I want to actually get to the main point here. In councils of government, we must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought, by the military-industrial complex. The potential for the disastrous rise of misplaced power exists and will persist. We must never let the weight of this combination endanger our liberties or democratic processes. We should take nothing for granted. Only an alert and knowledgeable citizenry can compel the proper meshing of the huge industrial and military machinery of defense with our peaceful methods and goals, so that security and liberty may prosper together. Now, I read this section, and obviously the rest of it there, just to set the context, because you have to remember a lot of the scientific funding mechanisms that we have today started during World War II, or at least the government ones started during World War II. And a lot of it was because of concerns about dealing with wartime issues and needing to be, shall we say, getting ahead of enemies on the battlefield at the time. And of course, the Cold War is still going on. You wanted to be ahead of the Russians. You wanted to be ahead of the Soviets with their activities and be more technologically advanced than they were. So that's the context in all of this in which Dwight Eisenhower is speaking. This is where he gets into the science part of it, and that's actually really fascinating to me, what he had to say. Akin to and largely responsible for the sweeping changes in our industrial military posture has been the technological revolution during recent decades. He's pointing to the scientific research that made so many things in World War II and so many of the technological innovations afterward possible. In this revolution, research has become central. It also becomes more formalized, complex, and costly. A steadily increasing share is conducted for, by, or at the direction of the federal government. Today, the solitary inventor tinkering in his shop has been overshadowed by task forces of scientists in laboratories and testing fields. In the same fashion, the Free University, historically the fountainhead of free ideas and scientific discovery, has experienced a revolution in the conduct of research. Partly because of the huge costs involved, a government contract becomes virtually a substitute for intellectual curiosity. For every old blackboard, there are now hundreds of new electronic computers. You got to remember, this is back in the time when computers were just becoming a thing and we didn't have the internet. The prospect of domination of the nation's scholars by federal employment, project allocations, and the power of money is ever present and is gravely to be regarded. Yet in holding scientific research and discovery in respect as we should, we must also be alert and to the equal and opposite danger that public policy could itself become the captive of a scientific technological elite. It is the task of statesmanship to mold, to balance, and to integrate those other forces, new and old, within the principles of our democratic system, ever aiming toward the supreme goals of our free society. So this is actually, it's very short, but you're thinking about the context of when Eisenhower was saying this, he knew full well of the development of research and innovation that led to so many things as part of being basically on a wartime footing. But since then, you think about the amount and ways of which scientific research funding has grown, and grown tremendously over what is, for all practical purposes, a fairly short amount of time when you're talking about 5-6 decades. He's talking about concerns with The prospect of domination of the nation's scholars by federal employments, project allocations, and the power of money is ever present is gravely to be regarded. What he's getting at is the central question is whether or not it's a good thing to have scientific research be funded in large part by the federal government. Um, and he also talks about, I would like to see more of his thoughts on this actually, because seeing this here does not tell me a whole lot about what he was actually thinking. Becoming the captive of a scientific technological elite. Um, but it is warnings to folks that maybe at times the current federal funding model of scientific research isn't perhaps the best way to do it. And truthfully, it's probably a wiser thing to be more diversified in what sources of funding we get. But that said, there's very little denying that a lot of the research that has resulted from federal funding of science has been great. Many things, and many more things that probably we today take for granted. But we should always be, as Dwight Eisenhower's saying in here, balancing a lot of these things. You can't allow one thing to override the other. And that's one of the reasons why I've said over time, many times on this channel, that there should be a balance of there should be a balance and recognition of what the role of science is, compared to things like the Supreme Court and what the role of the Supreme Court is, or what the role of a political leader is, compared to anything else. That one thing should not override the other necessarily. This is just some thoughts from me. I welcome your commentary and your thoughts on the whole issue. Hit the like button on the way out the door, comment on the video, share the video, subscribe to the channel, all that lovely good jazz. Until next time, I'm Adrian. May you stay curious.